the mullahs will be quaking in their boots, because one of the things that certainly he established through Kushner is a strong relationship with Saudi Arabia, and they'll be emboldened again to think that he'll have their back.
I'm Theo Usherwood, and this is Election of Our Times. Today, I'm going to be speaking to Major General Chapman, a former British military advisor to US Central Command, and Greg Swenson, Chairman of Republicans Overseas UK, about what a Trump presidency means for the world order. Major General Chapman, can I just start by asking you, what are the implications for NATO if Trump wins this election?
Well, there is concern, but in a way the Senate's already future-proofed Trump taking any unilateral decisions by the passing in December 23 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which meant he couldn't do anything unilaterally without two-thirds majority of the Senate. However, he's bragged about not implementing Article 5, which is the raison d'etre, really, of NATO, the collective defence. And more worryingly, he sort of said he'd leave the field to Russia for those non-bill payers. Now, those who are the bill payers are those who are actually closest to Russia. The Baltic states are all above 2.5% GDP. Poland's even more than the US at 3.3%. And essentially the intermaritime countries, those between the Baltic and the Black Sea, do pay their way. It's some really to the west of that who don't. But if you look at the continuity between what he said in the 2016 campaign and the current campaign, there are various themes which are consistent. The first one, he still sees dangerous competitors in terms of China and Japan, and the trade deficit plays into that. The second one, really in the NATO and EU spheres, is the sort of notion of those as ungrateful freeloaders. The third one with Iran from the Middle East, where he thought that they'd played us for fools, which was led to him going out of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, essentially the multilateral agreement which banned them for a nuclear agreement and not to go towards a posture of refining nuclear fuel. And fourthly, leave the field to them was something that he said in the run-up to 2016 with Russia, in the same way that he's recently said that Russia could do whatever the hell they want to non-bill payers. So there should be concern, but diplomacy doesn't really mean that you have the great man theory of international relations. That rarely works, and there are systems and procedures which would probably put caveats on President Trump were he to become the next president.
Greg Swenson, does Trump have a point within all of this? That actually there are those countries within NATO that just aren't paying their way, and that he needs to put a bit of stick about to make sure that they cough up, so we're not just relying on United States taxpayers to ensure that NATO can defend itself against a Russian, whether it's from Russia or anybody else?
Yeah, look, President Trump sometimes delivers those messages in an awkward way, or sometimes, an offensive way, but most of the time, or in this case anyway, he's actually right. And President Obama was making the same argument, before Trump became president. This is back when only 4 countries were meeting their 2% of GDP commitment. And, by the time Trump left office, it was up to 11. I think now it's at 21. So I think the message has been received. But there's a couple of concerns, I think, that even go beyond Trump and the any kind of risks that could be perceived from the things he says. And I agree. Sometimes those things, are a bit unsettling. There's what he says. There's what he said. The press says he says, which is sometimes different. And then there's what he does. But what he did was actually pretty productive. He increased defense spending, which is good for America, but also good for NATO. And now you have, granted you have 21 countries meeting the commitment, but the economies of those countries, Chip mentioned Poland, and I think it's great that Poland is spending a much greater percentage of GDP than both the Americans and the British. But, what I'm worried about is the big economies including Germany, are not meeting that commitment. And granted, the UK is playing above its weight in coming in at 2.5 or so. But I think what the other thing we really should worry about from 3 years or now almost 4 years of the Biden administration is Biden-Harris cut defense spending 3% in real terms 3 years in a row. And I would argue that, the world is a much more dangerous place, or at least unsettling now than it was 4 years ago. So, Trump increased defense spending. He sometimes exaggerates the scale of it, but he did increase military and defense spending considerably in his term. And that's where he gets the argument, I rebuilt the military. Well, that might be a bit of hyperbole, but he did spend more. And so with the U.S. still being 50% of NATO defense spending, 3 years at 3%, that's 9%, 4.5% of NATO defense spending has been cut, or it's been cut 4.5%, I should say. So, that there's some worrisome things about what's happened since Trump left. And if we can, of course, the rhetoric is unsettling, but in terms of what he does and his support for Ukraine when he was president, the support, the kind of flip-flopping in many ways that we had from the Biden administration on not only Iran, but the Houthis, as well as the Russians, taking the sanctions off of Nord Stream 2. Energy policy is really, in many ways, security policy, and by doing his best to let's say encourage less fossil fuel production, and Biden's hostility to the energy sector, resulted in a pretty quick drop of 1 million barrels a day from the U.S. We've become the swing price. We've become the world's biggest energy producer, and when Biden came in, immediately cut, for example, the Keystone Pipeline. He took, and then oddly took the sanctions off of Nord Stream 2 that Trump had put on. So there's all these sort of unusual or surprising things that Biden and Harris did to reverse some of the Trump policies that I would argue were constructive for both America and for Europe.
Chip, could you just walk us through, if America pulls out of NATO or says we're not going to stick by Article 5, that one for all defence, is the implication, do you think, and would the advice that you would be providing the American military if you were still in your previous post, that actually Vladimir Putin will finish off his war in Ukraine fairly quickly, emerge victorious, and then quite quickly have a look at some of those smaller Baltic states?
Well, certainly the Russian theory of victory is at the right of arc is wait for Trump and see if they therefore gain a relatively easy victory. And again, you have to look at what he said to see if that's viable in terms of the Russian theory of victory or not. And the first way to look at this is that in the May 2023 town hall meeting, he talked about not thinking in terms of winning or losing, but in terms of stopping the killing. Now, in its own way, that's admirable. You could say that's a humanitarian peace, but it's also potentially a surrender peace. It also has nothing to do with a just peace in terms of the sovereignty of Ukraine under the UN Charter. That would worry you from the first. The second bit of evidence might be his one-to-one with President Biden, where he seemed to suggest there that he wouldn't allow Russia to take over the illegally occupied territories, nor would he allow Ukraine's sovereignty to be lost. But Keith Kellogg, who's one of his potential national security advisors, has said that he will get Ukraine to the table by saying we'll withdraw our support if you don't get there. And he'll get Russia to the table by saying that he'll support Ukraine with everything if they don't come to the table. Now, of course, there's a difference between negotiations, and ultimately both of them will want to have negotiations, and to negotiate. What are you negotiating about? And that's probably the sticking point. The final thing is it's not clear that he's got the whole of the Republican Party on side with this. The last piece of evidence is really the Helsinki Commission. That was a report which came out recently, September this year, under a tutelage of a Republican Senator Joe Walker from South Carolina, who sort of really was instructing in the Russia-US policy, and that determined that the US should support Ukraine in both military and humanitarian terms, and that when Putin thoroughly understands the nature, when Trump thoroughly understands the nature of Putin, that he won't go down the line of some of the rhetoric he's used formerly. We'll just have to see again what the left and right of arc on that is. It's not clear, because what you do in potentially opposition and what you do in government are two different things.
But do you think there's a real politic to Trump's foreign policy, which is actually that if the war is going to be brought to a halt, if Russia's going to have to be handed, a portion of Ukraine in order for Vladimir Putin to feel like he can, show the Russian voters, the Russian public, that he has secured some sort of victory and withdraw his, military from other areas, or withdraw his, remove his ambitions to go even further with this war?
Yeah, I think there's real concern. I think we all, if we could, just wave the magic wand, have Ukraine win. But I think the path to Ukraine winning is really difficult. I've never really heard, a really, convincing argument that they can win. And so I think when President Trump says, we're going to end this thing quickly, and implies that there's going to have to be compromise on the territories, that sounds appealing to people, right? Because it just means the war is going to stop. It's not the outcome perhaps that we would want, from the beginning, but here we are 2.5 years later, and there's really no end game in sight. So, unfortunately, I think one of the arguments, and I actually heard this from a really smart and senior Democrat that I do some lectures with, that, the outcome would be more favorable to Russia than a Ukraine victory, obviously, right? But the war would end, and so I think the alternative is another 6, 12, what is it, 6 or 12 or 18 months of fighting. So there is, I think, some sentiment in the U.S., but also here, that wouldn't it be better just to end this thing? And I hate to say that, because it's then rewarding Putin for being an aggressor. And what does that mean for the future? Will he do it again and force compromises? So, but perhaps there's an outcome where Trump does make the threat to Putin, which he's done before. The old, if you invade, I will level Moscow. It's not very diplomatic, but it's something that, you saw during his term. There was no invasion. You had Crimea in 2014, and then, of course, the rest of Ukraine in 22. And I think sometimes Trump exaggerates his ability to keep Putin at bay. But, in terms of comparing the two administrations, the outcomes of these administrations, it looks like things were pretty peaceful in 2017 to 20.
Just to pick up on that point that Greg's made there about, what happens next, and Putin withdraws, we can't get the outcome we want when it comes to Ukraine. Is there not a danger that actually Putin comes back for more, that having secured some sort of victory, that actually he feels emboldened to have another go, and we could find ourselves, NATO could find itself very quickly having to or seeing Article 5 tested if Putin went for one of those smaller Baltic states, and actually, senior members of NATO, whether it be Britain, France, Germany, and indeed the US, face that test of coming to the rescue. And with Trump, that's not necessarily going to happen, is it?
Well, again, it depends what we mean by winning the peace for both sides. Now, if you look at Zelensky's victory plan, part of that, of course, involves the fact that he would be given some security guarantees post any agreement, and that there might actually be NATO troops who are in Ukraine to ensure that guarantee takes place. Now, that itself might be a trigger for any to make sure that the imperialist Putin doesn't go any further, because essentially NATO deterrence has been postulated on two things. Deterrence by presence, which is why, for example, even under Trump's presidency, we had the enhanced forward presence and the battle groups, now brigades, which have gone forward to the Baltic states, and the Americans in Poland, and indeed the American Fifth Corps headquarters has gone to Poland post 22 with the invasion of the full invasion of Ukraine by the Russians. So you want to win the peace. Early on in the conflict, we actually talked about neutrality for Ukraine, which still would involve the need for a large country, which it is, to trade space for time, and to have security guarantees within that notion of a neutral state, along with large armed forces. So you could have a peace of neutrality rather than a peace of someone being in NATO, and that would also be an outcome. But there's a large spectrum here of what types of peace there could be on the negotiating table. That's the important thing. Why I think you go back to the Helsinki Commission and Joe Wilson, and that really brings you back to Kaja Kallas of Estonia, Prime Minister, that Putin wants negotiations, but he doesn't want to negotiate for three reasons. He'll demand the maximum, something that he didn't have before. He'll issue threats, and he'll ensure that there are always useful idiots in the West who will give something in, and therefore you might have a third or half of something you didn't have before. And that will be his negotiating tactic, because there are people who always give in. Indeed, Stoltenberg even really said this sort of thing recently when he stood down as NATO Secretary General, that Ukraine might have to give 10% of its land in the same way that Finland did after the Winter War in 1940. But that was a war of conquest again, and led to the verb of Finlandization, when the entire foreign policy of Finland was caveated for the future. And I don't think that's the kind of peace I would see as a just peace.
Greg Swenson, is there something that in the fact that Putin at least fears Trump, that just, to the point you were making earlier about the fact that we had the invasion of Crimea in 2014, and now, after, during Joe Biden's tenure as president, we obviously had the invasion of Ukraine, that actually Putin sees Trump as somebody who is unpredictable, somebody who might act irrationally, and perhaps he treats him with more kid gloves. Or do you see some other explanation as to why, during those 4 years from 2016 to 2020, Putin appeared to be more reticent to launch military action with Trump in the White House?
Sure. I think there is some merit. I don't think it's 100%, but there is some merit to the unpredictability of Trump. That people are, someone like Putin could be afraid of what Trump might do. You had a lot of rhetoric on the left when in the first election in 2016, that Trump was this madman. He was going to start World War III, and in many ways he proved them wrong. He's not pro-war by any means. So, if anything, the threat of an unpredictable Trump is probably less now, than it was in 2017. But I do think, you have to, again,
you think it will work against him?
I don't know that it'll work against him. I just don't know that it's as powerful as it might have been when nobody knew him. And I think people know him now, like him or not, as sort of very much an anti-war person. And look who he's brought into his campaign and probably his administration is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's been a constant critic of the war machine and the military industrial complex and all that stuff. You traditionally used to hear from the left, and now you're hearing it from the right, which is kind of a new phenomenon. But I do think if you look at what, again, sometimes I wish Trump wouldn't say things that he says, and I wish that the press wouldn't misrepresent what he said and exaggerate what he said. But if you look at what he does or what he did, Biden and Obama, were sending blankets and other non-lethal materials to Ukraine, but they were shipping it to a U.S. air base in Poland and then putting them on commercial trucks. And they didn't want to offend. They're constantly concerned with escalation. I think that's Biden's favorite word. And they were shipping this material to Kyiv, in commercial trucks, not American flag trucks. They were very cautious and very worried about, somehow offending Putin. And Trump got in.
They were very worried about it being a NATO war, weren't they? They see the narrative that it's NATO against Russia as, the Moscow take, the narrative that that he wants to put out to his supporters and the Russian public, whereas they're saying no. And I remember I was interviewing the charge d'affaires from London to the UK, Matthew Palmer banner, and he was like, "No, this is not NATO's war. This is Ukraine's war, and we are in the background." And isn't that the case that actually, okay, there's the side of the offence, but there's also not wanting to fulfill that narrative or give credence to that narrative that this is America v. Russia?
Yeah, I think there's some merit to that. I mean, I've never been one to encourage escalation. It's not something anybody wants, but I think there has to be a message sent. And so, when Trump started sending Javelin missiles to Ukraine, he was doing it, with American, military cargo planes. He was doing, he was basically drawing a line in the sand that said, don't cross it like this. I'm going to do this. I'm sending lethal weapons to Ukraine. It's something Obama and Biden wouldn't do. And even after they took over, and same thing with the sanctions. He sanctioned Nord Stream 2. He really encouraged energy production in the U.S. that lowered the price, which makes the mullahs in Iran and Putin less powerful. And there's two humiliating moments in Biden's first term that I think really emboldened Russia. One was Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, flying to Moscow and begging Putin to pump more oil so Biden would do better in the midterms. Remember, the February 22 invasion, was a year into his term, but there was a lot of damage done before that. And, oil and energy prices in the U.S. and especially in the U.K. and Europe, they went up considerably before Russia invaded Ukraine. This whole argument that, that's Putin's inflation or, Putin caused the energy price spike, not true at all. Gasoline and petrol prices in the U.S. were up 66% before the invasion. It was all due to Biden's energy policies. And so I think, there's some merit to the fact that, energy is important. And I've said that already. The second humiliating experience, which we haven't touched on, besides Jake Sullivan begging Putin, was the Afghanistan debacle. And there's nothing that you can really point to factually, but I have to think that Putin, as well as other authoritarians in the world, felt emboldened after that. I can't imagine that Iran didn't. I can't imagine that the proxies of Iran. But I think after
that was Trump's deal. To be fair to Biden, were you talking specifically about the actual when it came to the withdrawal and how quickly the Taliban came riding back into power?
Absolutely, but Trump had talked about that for years, and the execution of the withdrawal was completely blown by Biden. I mean, Mike Pompeo makes the great argument. Yes, we wanted to get our troops back home after 20 years, but 2,500 troops on the ground, that's what would have done it, at least to protect the air-based program. And so it's fascinating to see the left argue that this was Trump's problem. 2,500 troops is pretty small. We have so many more installations with 2,500.
I mean, I disagree with what Greg has said there.
Go on.
For three reasons, really. Of course, the first one is the Doha Agreement was signed by Mr. Trump. The second one is that Biden actually elongated the timeline for withdrawal, which had been set by the Doha Agreement. He elongated it by 3 months. But in fact, for both of them, really, the key thing was Afghanistan still a terrorist threat to the West? And at the time, and still really now, because any terrorism emanating from there has not really been posited against the West, was it time for this forever war to end? And so for both Biden and Trump, the answer was yes, because you could use over-the-horizon capabilities, as we showed, or the Americans showed, by the killing of Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda afterwards. So there's no point sort of arguing about whether it was Biden or Trump. It was a pragmatic, realist policy. It was a realist school of American foreign policy, not the Wilsonian liberalism one to do with democracy or human rights or freedom or making sure that women had education. So it was pure pragmatic realism of the American foreign policy school, which deals with that.
And just to pick up on what Greg said, but just to bring you into this on this particular point, Chip Chapman, is there an argument that when it comes to dealing with Trump, there is an unpredictability that actually works quite well, that he has that strong, that idea of being a sort of strong man, that he sees himself in that particular ilk? Or do you think actually you need, the West needs the Biden, the Obama, or now we, here in Britain, the Starmer approach to, British foreign policy of, being more measured and being, rather than, in the same fashion as what we've seen from Donald Trump on the international stage?
I welcome a strong man, but it depends on your definition of leadership. So the definition of leadership for me is someone who's got the capacity and will to rally men and women to a common purpose, and the character that inspires confidence. The problem with a strongman approach and Trump thinking he's the great man of international relations is that he doesn't consult with many people. He doesn't often consult with his advisors, which is why a number of people in his last administration are sort of against him. And the raft, of course, is quite long. I mean, Greg mentioned Pompeo, you've got McMaster, you've got Mattis, you've got Bolton. There's a whole list of them, because he thinks he's this great genius, the strongman genius, who can take these unilateral decisions without understanding the second and third order consequences of this. And that can be really dangerous. And that, for example, it was shown in his 2020 peace plan for the Middle East, of course, which the reception from the Arab states in terms of them was that no one supported it. So going unilaterally to do something is not necessarily the best approach, in the same way that occurred with the JCPOA to do with Iran.
Greg Swenson, is that a fair point, that Trump, because he seems to think of himself, he's like the Apprentice star, kind of, but when you're dealing with really tricky, complex international issues, you don't actually need somebody who just goes, don't worry, I've got this, I'm going to do it all myself, I know exactly what the plan is, don't need your advice, we're doing this. Is there so there's quite a lot of validity, isn't there, to what Chip Chapman's saying? Actually, you need somebody who can take in, weigh up lots of different tectonic, lots of different narratives or concerns or issues, bring them all together, and then devise quite a sensible course that actually takes into account all of the tectonic plates, rather than a sort of headstrong leader who just wants to plough his own furrow and could end up in trouble very quickly because nobody's actually following him.
Yeah, Theo, I mean, it's a good point. And Chip, I agree with you. You made a really good point there. I worry sometimes that he doesn't listen to advice. What he did in his first term, and there's a risk to this, obviously, he'd listen to 5 people and he'd believe the last one in the room. It's just, there was a bit of incoherence to it. What I'm pleased with, and this, I'm not suggesting that it'll be a blueprint or a complete replicate of his first term, but he did take good advice, and maybe he should have done it more. And that's a very credible argument. But on the big moments in foreign policy, even taking out Soleimani, taking out the Russians in Syria, he used military strength carefully and tactically and temporarily, which is important. I think he made some really smart moves, but I think in most of those cases, the real push was from, Mike Pence gave him great advice. Mike Pompeo gave him great advice. So there were times where he took advice, but I do completely understand the concern that he doesn't always take good advice. So I hope to see some people around him, like in his first term. I think Americans were comforted, and Republicans too. We felt confident that he had so many military people in not just in defense, obviously, or national security positions, but even as chief of staff, for example, and other military leadership. And I think what happened is there might have just been too much. It should be a civilian command, and that's, I think, where he might have got into some disagreements with some of the guys. But yeah, I wish and would hope that he will take advice from people. I think he did it, but he likes to make it sound like he doesn't, like he's the man, he decided. Some of his great moments were actually other people's decisions, but he is the commander in chief and should and with credit. Yeah.
Can we just move quickly on to the Middle East? Because it's obviously we've seen, it looks as if there's some better news on the horizon. Where do you see, Chip Chapman, where do you see the Middle East conflict going with Trump in charge? Do you think that we'll see an emboldened Prime Minister in Benjamin Netanyahu? Do you think that a Trump election victory would leave the Ayatollahs in Tehran feeling particularly nervous? How do you see, a Trump victory impacting on the Middle East conflict?
Both of those things, really, Theo. So I certainly see an emboldened Netanyahu. And again, the evidence of that is through what Trump tried to do initially with the Abraham Accords and his peace plan, where he will double down on his support for Israel. I think also the mullahs will be quaking in their boots, because one of the things that certainly he established through Kushner is a strong relationship with Saudi Arabia, and they'll be emboldened again to think that he'll have their back. Because one of the things he's not done this time is have any rhetoric against sort of Muslims in the way that he did in 2016, for example. Stand fast all the stuff about Puerto Ricans in the last few days. And I think that is crucial for Saudi Arabia and for the wider security of the region, because that's really what you're trying to get to. So I don't think there's any notion towards a two-state solution. The problem with the 2020 plan of Trump's was that it sort of created a Swiss cheese model in Bantustans a la apartheid South Africa, and that's why it wasn't really supported by any of the other states. But as long as you can have a roadmap towards a more normalised situation, that will be a start in the Middle East. I don't see any notion of going, rocket fuel towards a two-state solution in this. And that all will play into Saudi Arabia being useful for the future if you can get to a ceasefire with purpose. Because one of the things that the Americans and the Saudi Arabia wanted, of course, was the dismantling of Hamas, because one of the things Saudi Arabia fears is Iran, the Muslim Brotherhood, and people often forget that Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood offshoot, unusual because they're not part of the Shia axis of evil. And of course the dismantling of the jihadists of IS and AQ. That was one of the predominant problems, of course, that President Trump faced in 2016. That's been largely dealt with. There is still a CENTCOM presence in the area dealing with the residual Al-Qaeda and IS presence, and there will be for a time until President Trump again might make a unilateral decision, as he did at one stage in Syria in his last administration.
Just to pick up on something you said about the fact that there's not going to be, if Trump wins, there's not going to be a two-state solution anytime soon. Do you see that playing out as Gaza basically being swallowed up by Israel, potentially the settlers in the West Bank, the Israeli settlers in the West Bank, feeling further emboldened, and actually we move to a situation in the Middle East where you have 4 million plus Palestinians who find themselves homeless, and it will be up to Trump and his administration to work with whether it's the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, to try and find another way somewhere outside of what would be an enlarged Israel for those displaced people to set up a new home, because this is something that's been was talked about in the immediate aftermath of October the 7th last year, but at the moment it is felt, at least internationally, the conversations, in the sort of, in the conversations about, trying to find a peace deal, it feels as if it's not necessarily at the top of the agenda about actually what happens to those Palestinian people who've been displaced.
Well, the first thing is that MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, has come out in the last couple of days and said that a solution should be in accordance with the 67 borders, and they've obviously gone far further than 67 borders since that, with the 67 war and the 73 war. The second thing is that the peace plan in 2020 actually enabled the settlers to take another 20% of what some people would call the occupied territories in the West Bank. Now we're 4 years on, or we'll be 5 years on when Trump gets in, if indeed he does get in. So question 4 in military analysis is, has the situation changed? And of course it has. So how do you reconcile all those things 5 years on from what was in a plan 5 years ago, which had no buy-in from the Arab states, to a plan now? Now, if I knew the answer to that, I'd be the richest man in the universe, because this is the question which has been on our minds from when I was first in the army. How do you solve the Palestinian problem? And wiser men than me for 45 years have had no answer to that.
Greg Swenson, do you see Trump and Kushner, between them, working with MBS and others, actually bringing a longer lasting resolution to the conflict in the Middle East?
I do. I think it was important that he reached out to them. This was his first foreign trip, remember, back in 2017. His first foreign trip was to Riyadh. Biden, of course, right out of the gates, even during the campaign, was he referred to MBS as a pariah. And, you can argue that, whether or not he is, but it's probably not something you say about one of your allies' leaders. So, yeah, I think the fact that Jared and President Trump, worked with the Arabs. They got, the Abraham Accords weren't perfect. They weren't universal, as Chip quite rightly pointed out. They had some holes in it. But when Biden took over, he would not allow the use of the word Abraham Accords or the term written in any memos or emails for the first 2 years. It was forbidden by staffers to even utter the word. I think he was just so unhappy, not with the outcomes, because who would be, but the fact that they were Trump's, and it just really drove him crazy. Now he flipped on that, like a lot of things, but he has come around to the Abraham Accords, and but I think there was a good chance the Saudis would have been one of the signers a few years later, or within a few years, because there was momentum. But I think when Biden basically stopped it, stopped the movement in its tracks. And then, of course, October 6th has thrown quite a wrench into that. So maybe they could come back there. I hear talk that there is at least conversation, but it's a shame that there was real momentum there, and it was really disrupted initially by the Biden administration, and then of course October 6th. But yeah, I think Trump would be better overall for the Middle East. I think the trick will be not just working with the Saudis and the Emiratis. The trick is Jordan and Egypt, the countries that border, Gaza, and really have no interest in taking refugees and aren't really lending much to the solution.
And do you think they need to be doing more, and Trump will be influential in getting them to do more?
Yeah, I would think so, but I don't know. I mean, obviously he's worked well with the Saudis, and then of course with the Abraham Accord countries. But I think it's going to take more than that. I don't know that Trump's the perfect vessel to do it, but I do think it's going to, we're going to need cooperation from the other Arab countries, and especially ones that, are bordering Gaza, but also not as wealthy and powerful as Riyadh and Abu Dhabi.
That's all from me, Theo Usherwood. My thanks to Major General Chip Chapman and to Greg Swenson for their time today. If you want more, subscribe, or you can listen live to Times Radio.